Developers. They both drive and define cryptocurrency value. They drive it by building the infrastructure and applications that make projects useful. And of course, it is useful things that ultimately catch on and get adopted. They define it because they have their feet on the ground. More so than investors, developers can see the trends in technology and move toward winning concepts, winning teams, and winning communities. Last week, I gave the altcoins a little pep talk, and I told you why, despite the Bitcoin dominance potentially being higher than any of the charts are currently reporting, why still I think now might actually be a good time to slowly start accumulating some altcoins. The question I left you with was pretty simple. Which altcoins? In this edition, I'm going to let the developers show us the way to the best buys currently on the market. And to do that, I'm going to introduce a new metric that I like to call the developer to market cap ratio. I'll be showing you how I use that, along with developer activity, to pick out what I think are currently the most interesting altcoin projects to look at. If that sounds good to you, do stay tuned. So I need to preface this video by saying that I am not a financial professional, and I'm not here to give financial advice. I'm just here because I like to talk about crypto and I like to share my opinions. So, as always, please do your own research. Now, you may be familiar with the very awesome developer reports that are published by Electric Capital, who I'm going to refer to from this point on as EC. If not, I'm going to talk a little bit about the report in general before I go into my personal analysis and tell you which projects I think the report is actually picking for us. The report is generated by basically just collecting data from GitHub. They watch how active the various projects are in terms of the number of developers on that project and the frequency of commits. And when I say commits, I just mean updates to code. The most recent report came out this past August, and it covers the cryptocurrency market as a whole for the first half of 2019. In the report, EC puts developers into three main, what they call, buckets. The first bucket is for one-time developers, which are developers who commit no more than one time per month. The second bucket is for part-time developers, and these guys commit anywhere from twice to 9 times per month. Then the final bucket is for full-time developers, and those guys commit code at least 10 times or more per month. So with those definitions out of the way, I want to highlight 4 main bullet points from the report, and then we'll move on to my analysis. Highlight 1. EC is telling us that for the cryptocurrency market as a whole, full-time developers have increased year over year. But as you might expect, the increase hasn't exactly been shared equally among the various crypto projects. It actually seems that developers are starting to consolidate or sort of coalesce around projects that have higher market caps. For this just means that we're going to be able to pick some winners and losers from the report. Highlight number 2 is that even though we had this increase in full-time developers, overall, there are now fewer total developers in the space year over year. So the important question is, where did we lose the developers? Which brings us to highlight number 3, which is that 80% of the developer loss came from those one time per month and part-time developers. Or another way of thinking about it is that 80% of the loss came from those sort of less serious developers, which also kind of makes sense because you can kind of imagine that a lot of these guys were sort of jumping on the bandwagon or kind of dabbling with the blockchain when the sun was shining. But then when we go into the depths of crypto winter, more and more of these less serious players are going to leave the game. On top of that, though, the biggest loss came from small cap projects. So projects that are outside of the top 100 by market cap actually lost the most developers. So what we're seeing is this theme of part-time developers leaving while full-time developers stick around, but understandably start to sort of huddle around the projects that are well capitalized. And that's something that I kind of hinted at in the last video. I mentioned that we need to be looking for projects that have lots of capital to fund their activities, potentially for years into the future, despite whatever wild turns the market might take. The final point I want to emphasize, number 4, is that smart contracts, infrastructure, and DeFi projects are the ones that are currently gaining the most full-time developers. This report really caught my attention because it's my opinion, and frankly the opinion of EC, that developer engagement is a forward-looking metric. Or in other words, developers are the ones who are actually creating the value that will ultimately predict where the market is going to go. And yeah, that might not always be the case in the short term, and absolutely, you can argue that the best tech doesn't always win. But the point I want to make here is that it isn't even about the tech, not always anyway. Sometimes it's just about building a community, and more developers for a project means more potential for a project to find useful applications, which ultimately, I think, will be the thing that drives adoption. And even in the short term, more developers means more frequent news releases. And if you've been in this space for any time at all, you know that the news is what drives the market. So here's what I wanted to do. I wanted to see if the report would identify some projects that, given how much the market has been crushed, are sort of on sale in terms of developer activity. Or in other words, I wanted to find the projects where I could most cheaply acquire the largest amount of developer engagement. And in a way, I was kind of looking to see if I could find any hidden gems in the report. But let me preface this by saying I wasn't necessarily wanting my gems to be too hidden. Like I said, I'm interested in projects that are well capitalized, so projects that I know are going to be able to stick around for the long haul. And in taking this view, importantly, I'm trying to think like a developer. And so with that in mind, I chose two main criteria that I've used to actually sort of filter through the projects and sort of like narrow down my list. So the first thing I decided on was that I only wanted to look at projects that were in the top 20 by market cap. Again, we're looking for staying power, right? Number two, I decided that I only wanted to look at projects that have at least 50 average monthly developers. And that 50 average monthly developers number will actually make a little bit more sense when we start looking at some of these charts. And this figure is what I'm actually basing my calculations for developer to market cap ratio on. It is a really cool graph. It shows average network value or market cap with respect to average monthly active developers. And here we're looking at most of the top 100 crypto projects, but we're zoomed into a level that excludes Ethereum and Bitcoin. And that's really the level of zoom we kind of want, obviously. Both of these projects have lots of capital, lots of developers, so they're not really news to anybody. They're the top two players in the game right now, and we're kind of looking for some projects that, relative to these two, are kind of like hidden gems. So what I did with this data is I generated a new metric that I like to call the market cap to developer ratio. And what this new metric shows us basically is how much you are going to pay in terms of market cap per developer on a given project. So these are my top values in terms of bang for your buck. IOTA actually comes out on top here, so we'll use it as an example. And all I'm saying here is, guys, is that if you're looking at IOTA, each monthly active developer on that project is costing you $9.3 million. Then if you look at Tezos, you're paying $9.6 million for each developer. Then for Cardano, each developer is costing you about $10.3 million. So out of the top 20, these three are like your best buys in terms of money you're going to spend to, like, in essence, buy active developers on a project. Now here, let me say that I generated this data today based upon market cap values that I pulled from coinmarketcap.com only a few hours ago. And these values are going to fluctuate day to day. So in just a minute, we'll look at some ways that we can further differentiate between our picks. We'll continue down the list though. The next one we have is Neo, then Monero, then Stellar, and then EOS. And here's where Ethereum falls, which we'll see here in a minute. We're kind of using like a threshold, like a cutoff for what we're actually interested in looking at. But for now, we'll just consider this as sort of like for informational purposes. It kind of puts everything else in perspective. Then past Ethereum, developers are getting more expensive, and you have Tron, and then you have Dash, and then finally Ethereum Classic. And you'll notice that all the way down to Tron, we have this kind of smooth gradient with the price per developer gradually increasing until you get to Dash, where suddenly the price almost doubles, and then to Ethereum Classic, where it more than doubles again. To me, this kind of suggests that in terms of value per developer, these projects might be a little bit overpriced, depending on what you think about those projects. But I'm going to move further down actually, and I'm going to show some more projects just for like more frame of reference than anything else, and just for a little bit of fun, to be honest. But if you go further down, what we can actually see are the much larger projects in the top 20. And so we have projects like BSV, Bitcoin Cash, XRP, Binance Coin, Litecoin, and then finally Bitcoin. Now, obviously, we can make a pretty good argument that a developer on the Bitcoin project really is, probably worth the $600 million that I figure here. And if you ask me, they're probably going to wind up being worth a lot more than that. But some of the others, I think we can see them as being a little bit more overpriced looking when you compare them like relative to Bitcoin. For instance, given the pace of progress around Litecoin, is each developer on that project really worth $463 million? Is Bitcoin Cash worth $148 million for each one of its developers? You want to pay $102 million for a BSV developer? These are just my feelings, but I think relative to when some of these projects are approaching the Bitcoin price per developer, it becomes a little bit questionable for me anyway. But going back to my top picks, I'm going to narrow down our results to all of those projects that are pricing their developers more cheaply than Ethereum. So that gives us 7. And in order of value, that will be IOTA, Tezos, Cardano, as the number 1, 2, and 3, and then Neo, Monero, Stellar, and EOS. Now, looking at this list, I already feel like I'm doing something right because, I think I'm kind of looking at 7 very, let's say, legitimate projects. And some of these may or may not be heading in the right direction lately, but overall, I think a lot of hard work has gone into each of the 7 that I've picked this way. And, they're all pretty solid. It's easy to see why they have a lot of developer support for any one of them. The question is, which of these actually amount to a really good deal right now? So let's move on to another chart from the report. And in this slide, they're showing us either gain or loss of average monthly developers from the second half of 2018 versus the first half of 2019. Here we can see our picks, including Tezos and Cardano, have actually gained some developers, with Tezos having gained a bit more than Cardano percent-wise. Then looking below the line here, some of our other picks have unfortunately lost some developers. Stellar lost just a bit at a loss of 1.58%. Further down, IOTA lost the next largest amount. Then you have EOS, then Monero. Then we see Neo losing the most out of our select group. Probably also worth noticing that Bitcoin Cash is the biggest overall loser here, even though we're not looking at it. I think maybe it's just a good FYI to have for any who are watching that particular coin. It looks like bad news to me. So anyway, based on that, let's see if we can reorganize our list a little bit. So now we're going to reorder them based upon ability to retain developers, essentially. And I think this is important because what this report is really telling us is that the developers are starting to move. They're starting to coalesce around the more dominant projects. And so we might want to bet a little more heavily on projects that seem to be gaining the most momentum. So I'm going to reorder them this way. Tezos at number 1, Cardano number 2, and Stellar at number 3, followed by IOTA, EOS, Monero, and then finally Neo. Now here I'm going to look at one final slide. This one is a bit more complex, but it shows all of the developers on a project, and it lets us see how active each developer is. So as I move up and down on the y-axis, and I'm just going to use EOS as an example here, I'm looking at developers. So if I move up and down this way, each point along the y-axis actually corresponds to a developer. And so if I pick one developer, which on this chart would be, one tiny pixel here along the y-axis, and then I move along across the x-axis, I can see how active that developer is. So up toward the top, where you see that there's like lots of sort of empty space, we have developers who are less active. And then as we move down, we can see developers who are more active. So really quickly, let's review what we've done so far. We've identified the projects in the top 20 by market cap that give you the best bang for your buck based upon the cost per developer. Next, we took those and we sorted them out based upon which ones seem to be gaining or losing developers. And then now in this final slide, what I'm interested in doing is looking at how active the developers actually are. Or in other words, if I'm picking up projects that are gaining lots of developers, that's great, but I want to make sure that these developers are actually active. It doesn't do me any good to buy a bunch of developers if they're just going to kind of sit around and not do very much, right? And this is where EOS shines, and for that reason, I'm going to let EOS make up some ground on my list. Another clear standout here is Cardano. Lots of highly active developers, guys who look like they amount to full-time developers for sure. We can compare this to Tezos, and our lines just aren't quite as dark. They have lots of developers, but they just seem to be a little bit quieter on this project. Same story for Stellar, really light, really sort of like light looking down toward the base. And then IOTA actually looks pretty similar to Tezos. If we look over at Monero, it actually looks a lot more solid than the other two. And if anything, I'd put it probably at number 3, right behind EOS and Cardano in terms of activity. But then if you go over here to Neo, though, it's actually looking kind of scary. It's looking really light here, but Neo is already at the bottom of our list, so we won't really worry too much about that. So considering these 3 basic metrics, here's what I've come up with for my best buys in the top 20 based upon developer engagement. Number 1, Cardano. Number 2, EOS. And number 3, Tezos. Number 4 is IOTA, 5, Monero, 6 is Stellar, and coming in last, I have Neo at number 7. So again here, EOS shows signs of losing some developers, but I think it's still a really strong project. And the other metrics suggest that they have a really solid core of developers who are staying really busy. So for that reason, I've moved it back up my list a good bit. Tezos and IOTA show a lot of promise, but it does seem like maybe their developers just aren't quite as busy as some of the other projects are, at least lately. Then Monero, I was actually surprised to find that they seem to have a lot of hardworking developers, and I don't mean that in any bad way. But I did, I bumped it down a little bit though, because I think the project might be losing a little bit of steam overall. And one argument against all this is that you can say that Monero is kind of a special case here, right? All of the others on my list are platform coins. They're interested in things like smart contracts, and generally, they have lots of sub projects. They make lots of dApps, right? Whereas Monero is a privacy coin, and so you might expect that it doesn't actually need a lot of ongoing development. It's just kind of doing its job, and it's already pretty much doing what it needs to do development-wise. So for that reason, you might want to just kind of consider it completely aside from the rest of the list. Stellar has its own story too, but I still think it's a pretty solid coin, so I'm putting it in at number 6. And after going through this process, guys, of the 7 I started out with, I'd really only signal Neo as a potential loser, at least for now. It seems to be losing a lot of developers, seems to not have a lot of development activity happening, at least at present. So it might be that its higher price per developer relative to projects like Cardano, for instance, might be a little bit too high, at least for now. The real gem here, guys, though, I think it's going to be Cardano. In fact, in doing this research, I got really interested in this particular project. And so in my next few videos, I'm actually planning on doing a deeper dive with Cardano. So stay tuned for that. And real quick before we finish, let me go back to this slide really quick. I don't want to leave fans of Maker and Basic Attention Token out in the cold. I think these two are really interesting, really definitely worth looking at. They just missed making my list because they're smaller cap coins. But if you're interested, both of them are cheaper per developer than any of the others that I talked about in this video. So here's where they fit in. You have BAT leading the pack in terms of value, with a lean $3.3 million per developer, followed next by Maker, more than twice the cost per developer at $7.7 million. With both of these being significantly cheaper than the rest of the group. You can see that we have IOTA next, and that's at $9.3 million, which is almost 3 times more expensive than BAT. Just something to think about. All right, guys, I hope you found this video to be very informative. If you'd like to hear more from me, remember to hit subscribe. Also, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think of my 7 picks? Did I get the order right? Did I leave any out that you think deserve a mention? Let me know. And until next time, if the market gets you down, take a closer look and turn the tables around.